Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of my videos naming every president who has lost their re-election bid. In my last part, we did both of the Adamses, John Adams and John Quincy Adams. Now we're going to be going on to our next few presidents. So, right now, Andrew Jackson is president, and a lot has happened. And first up, you've got the nullification crisis, with the first vice president, John C. Calhoun, being replaced by Martin Van Buren because of disagreements with Jackson over tariff issues, and Martin Van Buren is the frontrunner to win the Democratic Party's nomination. But there's a large opposition to Jackson in the form of what he's done as president. One out of the two major things he's done as president, one of which is the destruction of the National Bank, and the other is the removal of Native American tribes living in the South out west. And this opposition to Jackson is led by none other than Henry Clay, and it's known as the Whig Party because they named after the Whigs, the British Whigs, who protested against monarchy because they claimed that Andrew Jackson was a dictator. The Whigs had chosen to run regional candidates in the election of 1836 rather than coalescing around one candidate. William Henry Harrison was the Whig candidate for the Midwest. Meanwhile, Daniel Webster was the Whig candidate in the Northeast. Hugh Lawson White was the Whig candidate in many of the southern states, and Willie P. Magnum was the Whig candidate in the state of South Carolina. Ultimately, Martin Van Buren narrowly won his election, and the Whigs were unable to throw the election to the House of Representatives. You may be thinking that this was a dumb idea because the Whigs would be splitting the vote, but in states which Harrison was competing in, such as Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, candidates such as Webster and White, their names wouldn't even be on the ballot. So, anyway, Van Buren won, but all the economic growth that had been happening under Andrew Jackson came to a halt as the Panic of 1837 took place, because Andrew Jackson's bank policy is largely what is viewed as what caused this panic. Martin Van Buren, although he wasn't the one who caused it, the blame was put squarely on him for his inability to deal with the financial crisis. And in the 1840 election, the Whigs selected the old war hero, William Henry Harrison, to be their candidate in all of the states, rather than using that regional thing they did last time. And Harrison was mainly known for his success in the Battle of Tippecanoe, and his success in defeating the Tecumseh's Confederacy in the Midwest, as well as his service during the War of 1812. Many Whigs had also portrayed Harrison as as a man of the common man, and stated that he was born in a log cabin, even though this was his actual home. They had also attempted to portray Van Buren as a wealthy aristocrat, and it worked, because William Henry Harrison won by a landslide in the Electoral College. But don't let this electoral map deceive you. This was a map of all the counties. It was much closer in the popular vote and the county vote than much people would have expected at this time, despite the fact that all of the odds were stacked against Van Buren. And then Martin Van Buren became the third president who was not, and the first one who was not from Massachusetts, or whose last name was Adams, to lose re-election. Harrison's presidency, however, came to a quick end when he died of tuberculosis just 1 month into his term. And yes, it's a common misconception that he died of pneumonia. It could have been of pneumonia or tuberculosis. He did not necessarily die because he refused to wear a jacket on his inauguration. So, the next president to lose re-election, and keep in mind, in this period of time, there were a ton of one-term presidents, though mostly it was because they lost their primaries or they lost their nomination process, as well as the fact that they just simply chose not to run for another term. But We're going to be going into the presidents who lost their nomination process in some other video in the future, but right now we're just going to talk about general election defeats. So, in the election of 1884, the Democratic candidate Grover Cleveland was up against the Republican candidate James Blaine. This was probably one of the nastiest campaigns in history, with both candidates being very, very mean to each other, with stuff such as accusations that Cleveland had a child with a woman without her consent, and pretty much raped her and had an illegitimate child, while there were accusations against Blaine for being involved in some corrupt scandal, though ultimately Grover Cleveland won the election. Cleveland's presidency was marked by civil service and his willingness to just allow the most honest man to be in charge in the civil service. And as you can see in this article over here, many patronage supporters were not okay with this. Cleveland also supported free trade over protectionism, and this often led many big business owners to despise Cleveland, mostly because of his unwillingness to be their puppet, basically. The populist movement also came into play because many workers were upset that Cleveland had been lowering tariffs, and these tariffs, in their view, is what gave them their jobs. Cleveland's firm support of the gold standard also put him at odds with many farmers in the West, because they were pretty much poor by this point in time, and there was a growing movement to use greenbacks at this time, or some even more radical idea of using free silver. Ultimately, though, one thing that really hurt Cleveland was his vetoing of bills that were designed to give pensions to Civil War veterans who had honorably served in the Civil War, and this made many of them angrily oppose Cleveland. It also didn't help that Cleveland didn't even serve in the army during the American Civil War. Benjamin Harrison was nominated by the Republicans. Harrison wasn't that exciting, and he was actually the grandson of former President William Henry Harrison. But Benjamin Harrison had some sort of appeal due to the fact that he was acceptable to many big businesses, and at the same time was a supporter of what was known as bimetallism, which was the idea that that the economy should be backed by both gold and silver, not just solely gold, like what Cleveland wanted. Harrison's status as a military general during the American Civil War also helped him with that group of war veterans. The swing states in this election were mainly Indiana, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, although there were numerous others. Ultimately, Harrison won the election by flipping New York and Illinois. Every other state that Cleveland won in 1884, however, held for him. The fact that Harrison was from Indiana is what probably allowed him to win that state. Ultimately, though, despite the fact that Harrison won in the Electoral College, Cleveland actually improved upon his popular vote margin back in 1884. So this marked the third time actually in U.S. history where the winner of the election did not win the popular vote. And the election was extremely close, by the way. So anyway, let's talk about how Benjamin Harrison's next term went. So Harrison was mainly unpopular due to his support for what was known as the McKinley Tariff, which basically raised tariff rates substantially, and to this extent, it wasn't even meant towards protecting industry. It just outright hurt the economy. However, one big accomplishment by Harrison was the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was meant to regulate trusts or big businesses that were pretty much scamming people. Harrison also was a big supporter of what was known as bimetallism, but nevertheless, there was a growing radical movement to allow an influx of free silver into the economy. Harrison also was not very careful with how he was spending the money, or at least Congress was not, but Harrison was signing all of these bills, and most of those surpluses under Cleveland's administration were all wasted now, and the Congress at this time was known as the Billion-Dollar Congress. This had ultimately caused a recession. Ultimately, also, many of these big businesses did back Cleveland because of his staunch support. And not to mention the fact that many of the... So anyway, during this period of time, like, just forget about what I said, that was an accident. So, there was a growing mistrust towards businesses during this period of time. And there was a movement known as the Populist movement as an attempt to give power back to the common man, as many saw that both parties were incapable of doing this. They also supported a 32, or some supported a 16-to-1 ratio of silver to gold, and some even supported a 32-to-1 ratio of silver to gold. Some of them also supported an income tax, a gradual income tax based on wealth, as an attempt to prevent the rich from controlling American society. Many had also wanted higher wages, and many labor unions supported the Populist Party, though ultimately their main block of support was from farmers out in the West, ultimately they nominated their own candidate for president. And Grover Cleveland was back. He was ready for a rematch against Harrison, and was doing something unprecedented, which was running for a non-consecutive term as president. Donald Trump may do that in 2024, but who knows what may happen. Ultimately, though, Harrison had been a staunch opponent of free trade, and Cleveland positioned himself against free trade, but said that there should still be lower tariffs, but did not advocate for absolute free trade. There was also a bill that failed in the Senate, which was meant to address voting rights for African Americans. Grover Cleveland had opposed this bill, viewing it as giving too much power to the federal government. The Populist Party, which I mentioned previously, chose James Weaver as their candidate, and Weaver had a strong appeal to many of the farmers in the Midwest and the Far West. Ultimately, there were the same competitive states from the last election: Indiana, New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. But there were also other states such as Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, and even California was in play in this election. This election was a landslide victory for Cleveland in terms of the electoral vote. But when it came to the overall popular vote, this was actually Cleveland's worst performance in all three of his elections, despite the fact that this was his biggest electoral college victory. So, there you go. Cleveland beat Harrison in a rematch. So, you first have Harrison beating Cleveland and unseating him, and now Cleveland's unseating Harrison. Wow, this is interesting. So, anyway, Grover Cleveland became the first president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, and served up until 1897. So, who we've got next? Oh yeah, William Howard Taft. So, Taft was elected because of his promise to continue Theodore Roosevelt's policies, and he ultimately won because Theodore Roosevelt was widely popular. So, he was largely meant to continue Teddy Roosevelt's policies, and he actually did that. But nevertheless, there were still some growing issues between the two, mostly over the Payne-Aldrich tariff, and even though Taft had campaigned off of tariff reform, the Payne-Aldrich tariff actually increased tariff rates, which was unpopular among many progressives in the Republican Party who had advocated lower tariffs. Not to mention the fact that Taft was not as committed to conservation as Teddy Roosevelt was. While he was a supporter of conservation, he just did not believe that the federal government should be as involved in it. So ultimately, many of the moderates had backed William Howard Taft, while many of the progressives had backed Teddy Roosevelt. And these progressives, who had previously been staunch supporters of Teddy Roosevelt, began to start to hate Taft and viewed him as walking back on those progressive promises. Theodore Roosevelt was also most notably enraged at Taft because of his because he was unable to continue exactly what Roosevelt wanted, which is why Roosevelt started his own third party, which was known as the Progressive or Bull Moose Party. The Democrats chose Woodrow Wilson as their nominee. Woodrow Wilson was a Southerner. He was born in Virginia and lived most of his life in the Deep South, or at least his early life. And in fact, one of his earliest memories was seeing Jefferson Davis. But anyway, by this point in time, Woodrow Wilson had moved to New Jersey, and he was the governor of New Jersey. Woodrow Wilson had advocated for lower tariffs and more free trade, as well as the establishment of a Federal Trade Commission, as well as a Federal Reserve. But Theodore Roosevelt had a different idea of things. He advocated for what he called New Nationalism in opposition to Woodrow Wilson's New Freedom, even though they were both very similar. He was willing on going even further by supporting stuff like women's suffrage, the addition of primary elections, as well as a limit on dark money or how much money corporations could spend on politics. This sounds quite familiar. Ultimately, and one of Teddy Roosevelt's main promises was to increase spending on Social Security and to establish a Social Security, first of all. Roosevelt ultimately split the vote with Taft, which is what allowed Woodrow Wilson to win a landslide election because of the Republican split between the moderates or conservatives and the progressives. As you can see, though, this election could have been a lot closer, and maybe even had Roosevelt done a bit better, he even could have deadlocked the Electoral College. But anyway, needless to say, it's most likely that had Roosevelt not split the vote, Taft would have won re-election. But nevertheless, Taft actually continued his public career as a Supreme Court justice, in fact a Chief Justice, something like 8 years after his presidency. Alright, we've now got Herbert Hoover. So, Hoover was elected in 1924 mainly because of how popular outgoing President Calvin Coolidge was. And yeah, he easily beat his Democratic opponent Al Smith, largely due to the popularity of Coolidge and his own popularity as Secretary of Commerce, as well as the fact that there was a booming economy and the fact that there was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment against his opponent, New York Governor Al Smith. So, anyway, most of this anti-Catholic sentiment is what led this map you see here. Even some states which had never, ever gone Republican, such as Texas, voted for Hoover. Now, this economic growth, however, came to a halt as the stock market crashed. Not to mention the fact that the Federal Reserve was pretty much like out of money. Now, this had led to many bread lines and soup lines over a widespread economic recession. Hoover had attempted to fix the problem and actually did quite a bit in response to the Great Depression. But the problem was that all of his solutions either made the Great Depression worse or did absolutely nothing at all. And one of them was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which he signed into law. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act had increased tariff rates, which ultimately damaged, even though it may have looked like it was trying to help the American economy, ultimately all it did was cause a decline in international trade because many of these other countries were pursuing their own retaliatory tariffs, which led for the entire world to become depressed. There was also a lot of illegal smuggling of alcohol into the country because of how unpopular Prohibition was, and nearly everyone was violating the Volstead Act. FDR ran as Hoover's opponent in this election. He was nominated by the Democrats, and he was very charismatic and could pretty much easily beat Hoover without even campaigning because of how unpopular Hoover was. And yeah, he scored a landslide victory. This is probably the best performance anyone has ever done against an incumbent president. Can you see any red, outside of this area here? Yeah, pretty much none. Look at how blue the South is. Oh my god. So, yeah, Hoover got destroyed. Despite the fact that he was an incumbent president, he lost by a landslide. And keep in mind that these were his election results just 4 years ago. So yeah, that's a pretty massive swing right over there. And yeah, FDR became the next president, and he actually broke that two-term tradition established by George Washington and served as president for over 12 years. Alright, we've got Ford next. So, Richard Nixon, let's see. Oh, Watergate scandal. Now, because of that, Nixon's forced to resign, as well as the fact that his vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigned like a year earlier because of allegedly accepting bribes. So, Agnew was replaced by Gerald Ford, a popular representative from Michigan. And Ford ultimately made the controversial decision to pardon Richard Nixon of any crimes he committed, including Watergate. Not to mention the fact that there was a ton of stagflation, which was basically a mix of basically slow growth in the economy and high inflation. Ronald Reagan attempted to run a primary challenge against Ford and was widely popular among many conservatives. However, during this period of time, Ford had made numerous achievements, such as achieving a nuclear missiles agreement with the Soviet Union, as well as reducing taxes, which made him more popular among conservatives, and ultimately Ford won the Republican primary. His opponent in the general election was Jimmy Carter, an outsider from Georgia, who was not really that much into national politics, and mostly campaigned on the fact that he was an outsider who was going to fix Washington. However, even though Carter was surging in the polls, this all came to a halt once the Playboy scandal came out and the fact that he had gone on Playboy and said some pretty controversial things. And not to mention the fact that during the debates, Ford performed much better than expected and actually won many of the debates against Carter. The economy was also improving, so the election was going to be close. But ultimately, Jimmy Carter ended up winning, and after performing a second debate where Ford made a gaffe, saying that there was no Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe, that had caused Carter's support to boost. Not to mention the fact that the Republican vice presidential candidate, Bob Dole, made a gaffe stating that all of the wars, like Vietnam, the Korean War, those were all the fault of the Democrats. And that ultimately also hurt Ford. So the swing states were California, Texas, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Ultimately, Carter won narrowly, despite the fact that Carter was pretty much blowing out Ford in the early polls. Later, as the election got closer and closer, Ford ultimately won. Carter ultimately won narrowly, but Ford very well could have won and pretty much upset everyone. And this was the map at the time. So, stagflation crisis only continued though, and as you can see, under Jimmy Carter's presidency, things did not get much better. Even so that there was a opposition to his candidacy by another Democrat named Ted Kennedy, who claimed that Carter was just too moderate, and many of these progressives ran a campaign against Carter. Carter ultimately won his primary, though not the most impressive showing by an incumbent president. There was also the crisis of a war in Afghanistan. Despite the fact that earlier Carter had pursued conciliatory policies with the Soviet Union, after a war in Afghanistan, Carter abandoned this approach and more tensions came. Ronald Reagan ran against Jimmy Carter, remember the guy who tried to primary Ford? Well, yeah, now he's challenging Carter, and he's coming out with a ton of momentum, mostly with his support from conservatives, and now actually moderates too, because of how unpopular Carter was. Reagan was a staunch anti-communist, and did not want to compromise with the Soviet Union. He also was a big fan of trickle-down economics, and basically the idea where they should lower taxes on the wealthy, and as an attempt to basically spur economic growth. Reagan had also campaigned as an opponent of the New Deal, and the New Deal liberalism, which had been dominant throughout all this time. He also was a big supporter of Barry Goldwater in the 1964 campaign, which did make him somewhat controversial because of his war stance, but nevertheless, after the Iran hostage crisis happened, Carter's support really began to plummet, especially after Reagan demolished Carter in a debate. And this was the map, an absolute landslide win for Reagan, winning pretty much every state except for Carter's home state and a few states which had pretty much never gone Republican during this period of time. And yeah, here's the county map. So there you go, a pretty big defeat for Jimmy Carter. So anyway, now let's look at what happened under Reagan's term. Well, after he stepped down, Michael Dukakis was the frontrunner for the Democratic nomination in 1988 because Reagan was term limited, and George H.W. Bush, Reagan's vice president, ran against Dukakis. Ultimately, Bush won the election mostly through criticizing Dukakis and through attacking him. The Iraq War, the Persian Gulf War also happened during this period of time, and it was a massive success. Not to mention the fact that the Soviet Union dissolved and became the Russian Federation. Also you had the North American Free Trade, the North Atlantic Trade, you had I'm pretty sure it was the North American Trade, hold on a minute, give me a minute. Yeah, the North American Free Trade Agreement, I'm sorry about that, between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. And this free trade policies, as well as other foreign policy successes, ultimately helped Bush a lot. And his popularity was something like 70% approval rating. However, this all came to a halt once a recession happened. This recession was largely caused by out-of-control spending under Reagan, which caused the deficit to spike. Also, the out-of-control spending during the Persian Gulf War, as well as the fact that... So, yeah, I'm not an economist, so I can't exactly say what caused this recession, but all I know is that George H.W. Bush increased taxes as an attempt to balance the budget. And this actually worked out, and even though his successor, Bill Clinton, gets most of the credit for all this, for the surpluses during this time, this was actually Bush. So anyway, around this period of time, Bush's support among many conservatives began to halt, particularly due to the fact that there was still a large deficit, as well as the fact that, back to what I was saying, the Democratic opponent was Bill Clinton, who Bush actually had to fend a primary challenge from another Republican, Pat Buchanan, who ran as a more conservative alternative to Bush. But Bush ultimately won the primary. So, as time progressed, though, the economy was ever so slightly getting worse and worse, and the deficit was massive. So, Bill Clinton campaigned off of ending the deficit, and there was also a third-party candidate, Ross Perot, who basically said that Bush and Clinton are the same and we need someone new around here. And Perot was actually invited to the debates, and he did quite well. And he was actually seen as the winner in many debates. So ultimately, Bill Clinton won the election by a landslide, and many people have actually attributed this to Ross Perot splitting the Republican vote. Although this is not exactly that true, especially if you look at the fact that most of Perot's supporters were opponents of the North American Free Trade Organization, and they opposed free trade policies, as well as the fact that they hated the two-party system. And ultimately, Bush lost the election and Bill Clinton succeeded him, although Clinton didn't even get 45% of the popular vote. So, there you go. Thank you for watching this video. I'm not going to go into the 2020 election because it's just too recent. And I'll say this, the 2020 election was decided fairly. I'll say that. But I think it's too controversial to talk about the 2020 election. Not because of the result, but because it's just too recent in our history. So, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to talk about the 2020 election. So, thank you all for watching this video. Make sure you like this video and subscribe. And yeah, bye.